I'm Prue McSween. Thank you for joining us and welcome to this very special live event for mothers of sons. Tonight we're launching our very important new campaign about something that's been in the news quite a bit lately. We're determined to stop schools shaming our sons. Joining us tonight is someone who should be no stranger to any of you. She's a well-known writer and commentator who specialises in gender issues. We're very lucky to have her joining mothers of sons to help us out on this campaign. And of course, I'm talking about Bettina Arndt. Tina, thanks so much for joining us tonight on this very important issue.
Thank you, Prue, and thank you for coming along to Mothers and Sons. I know all the mums really appreciate having you here.
Oh, well, I think this is such an important cause. We are making so many important statements, particularly in tonight, but previously as well.
Yeah, well, it's a long battle to get the issues to do with boys and men heard properly in this community.
Exactly. Well, you know, shaming boys has been in the news with 2 Victorian schools being exposed for making boys apologise just for being male. At Brower College in Warrnambool, boys had to stand up and apologise to girls for men's violence.
We all got labelled as predators.
They told us to stand up and turn to a girl in our class and say sorry.
Absolutely shameful. At Parkdale Secondary College, a youth worker made boys stand in class and then attacked them as male oppressors.
Kingston Council held a presentation at Parkdale Secondary College, and the youth worker at who was presenting at the college basically told the Year 11 male students to stand up and basically if they were Christian, white and male, and basically set an example of them, labelling them as oppressors.
Unbelievable, isn't it? And just last week, a teacher at Como Secondary College in Perth stormed into a change room and told boys celebrating a soccer win that they sounded like a bunch of testosterone-fueled, misogynistic boys.
Yeah, that's the school there.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Bettina, you've been speaking out about this for years, about the shaming of boys in school. It's just not getting any better.
No, but I was very pleased to see the press responding in the way they did. They seemed to think this was a big news, these boys being shamed. And that's what really struck me, that people don't realise it's been going on for years and that it's right through our school curriculum. And that's one of the things I really want to expose today, is the fact that we're going to see experts and people who've studied the curriculum across various states across Australia talking about that to show what's going on here. But I just quickly want to explain a little bit about our campaign, in case we'll go through a bit more of this at the end, but just so that people know what it's all about. You can of course go to our website and you'll learn a bit more about what's going on here. But the idea is to encourage people to come to us. I mean, often parents who are worried about this stuff being taught to their boys are nervous of speaking out. And we thought, well, if they come to us with the evidence of what's going on, photos of the curriculum, bits and pieces to show the sort of way boys are being shamed in our schools, we can then take that evidence to local media. So that's the plan, and we have to see how that develops. But I wanted to... we've got tonight also a message from Mark Latham, who's one of the people very few people in Australia who's been consistently speaking out about, the introduction of identity politics into the curriculum. And Mark sent a message to wish us luck in our campaign.
Thanks so much for standing up for your sons. It's not just in Victorian schools that we've seen shaming of boys just for being boys. It's also happened in New South Wales. There was a school on the North Shore of Sydney where consultants came in and told the gathering of Year 11 young men that they were examples of toxic masculinity, they were potential and likely domestic violence perpetrators into the future. And when one of the lads called his mate a fool, they said, oh, it's the sort of thing that causes male suicide. And they copped a 90-minute lecture on that. So have no doubt there's a real attempt by these crazy leftists to get into the schools and diminish the self-esteem and the confidence of young men, to call them out and denigrate them and pick on them for things that they personally haven't done. Now, we all talk about mental illness in our schools. Well, this is obviously one of the causes, destroying self-esteem, destroying confidence of young men. We should be building them up and telling them about the great things they should achieve in the world, instead of all these ridiculous left-wing labels, running them down, shaming them. And I congratulate the mums, part of this forum this evening, trying to reverse that and standing up for their sons.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's so important that we have your support, and someone who's respected as much as you are. You talk about the impact on these young boys, and when you think about the psychological long-term impact this is going to have on them, this is what worries me. So it seems to be happening, though, this shaming of boys. It's not just the fault of random teachers. It's part of the school curriculum. Can you believe that? It's unbelievable.
Yeah, well, it is this message, as Mark said, so telling boys that they're toxic and violent and dangerous. And they're in official programs all over the country now. And we're going to show some of these this evening. We've got one of our guests who's here with us tonight is a man called Christopher Vogel. And he came to me a few years ago, actually, because he was doing a master's thesis on he'll explain it to us, but essentially looking at a particular program which is designed for child protection. Chris, are you there now?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, good. Sorry, I stuffed that up. We were hopping around a little bit too much. Anyway, I'm glad we've connected with you. And here's Prue McSween.
Hi, Christopher. Thank you for contacting and reaching out to Tina. It's so important we understand what's going on in the curricula at schools.
Now, Chris, tell us about how you got involved with this. You were being trained as a teacher when you were first exposed to this particular child protection program.
Yeah, well, I did the curriculum training to become a teacher along with all the other teachers. And after about the first hour of the training, the teachers at my table, we all started looking at each other to check if we were all seeing the same thing. That the teacher training seemed to be pretty biased in its presentation of the facts. The language was mostly gender neutral, but every single example and video resource provided showed a boy perpetrator and a girl victim.
So you were alert to the fact there was something weird going on, and you decided to then do some research, really analysing this bias. And one of the things, so you went through all the different examples in this particular program. The curriculum goes through from kindergarten to high school, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And did you, so with that, what you did is pulled out all the examples of someone abusing someone being violent to someone's, issues to do with people treating each other badly, essentially, and analyse whether it was male to female or female to male. Now, we've got some examples we'll show as we're talking about this, Chris, but tell us what you found.
Well, I found that with the cross-gender stuff, things are pretty biased. The curriculum deals with bullying between girls, and to some extent it deals with bullying between boys about 4 times as much. But it's the bullying across the sexes which shows the boys exclusively as villains.
Yes. Maybe you could read out a couple of these examples to us?
From that screen, they get pretty dark. They talk about a father's male friend from squash comes over when he is not there, and there's a little girl alone in her room, and he moves closer, and it gets pretty dark. Yeah. It
starts off, I think you told me that the kindergarten kids, one of the things that was striking was that all these, there was just this difference in the ways boys and girls were presented, that boys tended to be much more negative. Images of them, and then it gets more and more, violent and aggressive and so on as you move through the curriculum.
Yeah, it starts in kindergarten. We noticed that the curriculum recommends children's books for the kindergartners. Yeah. And all the stupid and dangerous animals in the stories were boys, and all the smart and brave animals were girls. And that absolutely has an effect on little kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, but the sort of examples we were showing were from later in the curriculum, where you see these very graphic examples of girls being beaten up by boys, or, the fathers being aggressive towards the mothers, a whole range of situations. And the total numbers were something like over 80 examples of the guys being the bad guys, if you like, and only one where it was, the woman was moderately abusive to a male. Is that right?
Actually, the one example of the female aggressor towards the male was a sub question of a larger question about boys bullying other boys. And it was a little question saying, well, what if the bullying was done by a girl? And that was the only incident of a girl bullying boys.
Now, the people who run the education department, the bureaucrats called you in to present this data to them, and they were quite positive about it, I gather, but there hasn't been any real change in the curriculum. It's still going as it was. Is that right?
Currently it is exactly the same as it was, but I'm told there are changes scheduled for the future.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that really struck me about this curriculum, is you mentioned to me, is that, okay, we have this presentation of males as the aggressors, the males as the violent ones, but the flip side of that is the fact that males who are victims, who are being abused, are really being silenced in that process, aren't they? Very
much. Teachers are being trained to ignore boys' pain, and the boys are told that it doesn't really happen to them. They're absolutely being silenced. Yeah, and the interesting thing is that there's a famous woman called Frida Briggs, and the program was sort of dedicated to her, and she was a long-time advocate for child protection. And one of the things she often spoke out about was boys being ignored, and the fact we don't, I mean, just as we once used to ignore all victims of sexual assault, child victims of sexual assault, we didn't hear what they wanted to tell us. Now we're just ignoring half of the equation, which is the boys, and it's sort of tragic that this wonderful woman, that her legacy is being ignored in this program. Very much so. You can find her videos on YouTube saying the curricula is failing boys. They don't see what happens to them as abuse because they're told that it's not. It only happens to girls.
And are you seeing in the classrooms, Christopher, the impact on this on young boys? Is it very obvious that they're being shamed and that a great divide is being encouraged between boys and girls?
Yes, I've seen it in 5 different schools now. When the presenter comes out and starts out with the standard narrative of boys are bad and the girls are good, the boys shut down. They're not listening anymore. They're sick of it.
Yeah, I can understand it. And what astounds me is that the White Ribbon Association is a sponsor of this program. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it looks like, I've really looked into it. A lot of the issues with the curriculum seem to stem from the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women. Mm-hmm. And because of this legislation, the Department for Education has been directed to get all of its data from feminist political organisations like White Ribbon and Our Watch. And they're not research institutions, they're ideological political organisations. It's like getting all your information about politics from only one party.
And this propaganda is being fed into these programs and other similar programs across Australia. Christopher, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been very good to have you contributing to your knowledge about this important area.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, Christopher. I mean, what concerns me, it's not just the curriculum, it's also the teachers, because as Mark Latham was talking about, the march of the left into these institutions, these woke people who have an agenda, who are grooming our children. And this is the influence they have on a daily basis is terrifying.
And of course, there's no question we have seen more and more female teachers, fewer and fewer male teachers, and male teachers who are in a school situation and are uncomfortable about what is being taught, feel very isolated. And that's partly why they come to me to discuss it.
Yes. I know you want to talk about this White Ribbon issue because I think we should tell people a little bit more about that organisation.
Yeah. I mean, it's very well known, and a lot of people think it's doing a wonderful job, and at one level it is.
It's aiming to bring together men to speak out about violence against women.
Yeah, that was the idea.
Yes.
I mean, it's sort of virtue signalling in a sense of, we're the good guys, we're standing up against violence against women, and they've done an incredible job going right through, getting into the schools across Australia, getting into workplaces. I've had complaints for years and years and years about White Ribbon. Now, here we have an example at high school in Kempsey. So that was a group of boys standing up speaking out against violence against women. And this is the essence of it, getting boys to make that sort of statement.
And of course, no one wants to encourage violence against women. We don't want violence against boys, and we don't want this kind of victimisation against boys, which is, to me, equally as bad. And this is where it's so crazy. I mean, many people would think that there is nothing wrong with that, but it's a good thing for men and boys to talk about stopping violence. But you know, the thing is, we've just got to get the balance right.
Well, there's no balance.
No.
And that's the whole point about the white ribbon programs. And that's what people have been complaining about to me for years and years, that they have a message that is simply one way. It's all about violence against women, and totally leaves out the other side of the story. And that's the important point here.
Exactly.
White Ribbon is an anti-male violence organisation which for years has been working in schools teaching students about domestic violence. But they tell them only one side of the story.
So, I mean, they've got a wonderful organisation full of, you know, all these symbols and slogans and so on, and they're out in schools teaching this issue. So it's all violent men. It pretends that women are never violent.
And to explain more about the problems with the white ribbon approach, Bettina spoke a little earlier to a Sydney psychiatrist, Tanvir Ahmed, who we all know and respect, who used to be a white ribbon ambassador until he wrote a newspaper article telling the truth about domestic violence, and white ribbon, if you can say that, fired him. Now let's look at that interview.
Hello, Tanvir. Thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to be with you, Bettina.
No, I was delighted to have you because you used to be a white ribbon ambassador for about 6 years. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And arguably, I was one of the more prominent ones. I did a program for them where I visited Pakistan. I did a host of school events. So I was really quite involved with their program.
Yeah, and I assume you thought this was a good thing for men to join an organisation and get involved in speaking out against domestic violence.
Well, I think the fundamental idea is certainly a good one. Certainly the cause seemed like a very good one.
Yeah, I think a lot of men are attracted because, you know, this seems like a good thing to do, but you gradually learnt that what white ribbon was teaching was really only one side of the story.
Look, to some extent, I mean, I probably, my clash with them came because I was trying to really just write my own observations of the various trends I may see amongst my patients and elsewhere, which seemed like fairly just mundane observations. Mm-hmm. But you could see that touched on certain sacred ideas in the movement. Yeah. In the broader, say, radical feminist movement, there are certain sacred ideas which aren't necessarily based on science or fact. Yeah.
So, I mean, so you started to realise that essentially white ribbon is promoting a particular narrative about domestic violence. Yeah, go on.
Well, I don't think I necessarily realised that till I just wrote what I thought were mundane observations about other contributors, you know, be they mental illness, substance abuse, socioeconomic factors, how ethnic groups may have different trends. So trying to look at the complexity of the issue, you know, rattled aspects of the movement, which made me, I guess, more clearly see that it was fundamentally based on a misnomer, on a false idea that it was entirely about some sort of original sin of males in general.
Yeah. So you wrote this newspaper article, as you say, just talking about your own experiences as a psychiatrist, what you'd observed, and you were jumped on from a great height, and received an enormous amount of flack because it went against the white ribbon narrative, which is essentially about men being the villains. The men, you know, it's a very strict view of domestic violence.
Yeah, more than even men being the villains, that there was fundamentally innate about men being violent to women.
The basic premise of what white ribbon is teaching in schools is that domestic violence is caused by disrespect for women. It's about misogynist attitudes. It's about little boys having the wrong ideas and not treating women properly. And essentially, I would argue that the research shows very clearly that this doesn't apply in egalitarian countries like Australia. If you look at the world, there's research that brings in countries all over the world, including deeply misogynist countries like Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and then you get this link between domestic violence and attitudes towards women, but you don't get it showing up in countries like Australia. So what we're teaching in schools is essentially a myth, and a very dangerous one. Do you see this as problematic, what we're teaching in these white ribbon programs?
Yeah, and more than dangerous, it's just a huge waste of money too, isn't it? Like, it's no question, like over the last decade and a half, 2 decades, the amounts of money that has been spent on domestic violence programs, and with little domestic violence has come down, and I'm not convinced these programs have much to do with it. So almost every 5-10 years, you get a new kind of drama and a new kind of panic, and the government responds by funding more and more money into these groups. And arguably, they have little impact at all because the diagnosis is often wrong. What I see, certainly clinically, is you get a combination of, say, certainly in the male, you see it in relationships. So it's often more about bad relationships, poor communication. You have, amongst men, it's often quite poorly inarticulate men who can't tolerate any sort of frustration. So they certainly have problems with anger. And this is where many of these anger management programs, etc., are appropriate. They're quite useful. You see men with substance use problems. You see men with mental health problems.
We've talked about this before, Tanvir. You'd also agree that the bulk of the international research shows it's not just men. That most
absolutely, it's very common. It's very common where women are violent too, and in those sort of settings, they often won't easily present, or the men are quite ashamed to bring it up. And remember, there's a reasonable proportion of same-sex relationships too. So you have quite a variety of relationships now where violence can occur, and in each of those, the dynamics can be slightly different. Women are often violent with a background in what we call personality disorder. So the most common is what's known as borderline personality, where women who are especially sensitive to feeling rejected, abandoned, criticised, and that's when they're more prone to becoming really lashing out or becoming violent. And that's certainly very common in psychiatric practice. You see a lot of that.
And of course, that's what the research has been showing for the last 40 years, these complex patterns related to mental illness, drug and alcohol abuse, real complexity. And you wrote about that, and White Ribbon essentially fired you as an ambassador, didn't they?
Well, that's right. I guess that whole movement sort of fell apart because there's almost a bargain that, yes, we'll have you as male kind of champions, but you certainly don't rock the boat at all. If you don't shut up and, toe the line, so to speak.
They're very deliberately ignoring the reality of what people like you are experiencing and what the actual literature is showing. What I'm concerned about is, what does this do to little boys to be told they are responsible, that they have to apologise, that they have to speak out against men, against masculinity, while the little girls just sit on and watch this? Do you have concerns about the impact on males growing up in this culture?
Well, absolutely. Where as I was saying earlier, there's almost this original sin, much like being white, also of just being male. And one, builds a lot of shame and a kind of low self-esteem potentially amongst males and resentment too. Arguably, if you're going to try and build a class of resentful males, which may lead to violence, you've probably got a better chance doing that by pushing some of these programs where they have to walk around in this cloak of sin. And it's just not very helpful. I think already we live in an environment where it's almost quite difficult. It's almost confused now how males and females should interact, be it in the workplace, be it in the schoolyard. And you throw this on lots of boys before they've even started having any sort of relationships. And arguably males are more timid and passive than they've ever been in the current culture.
And then the other side of it is, of course, we're teaching women that they're never responsible for violence, that if they've grown up with a violent mother, they're not allowed to talk about that. I mean, that's the other side of this coin. Women as victims, women without any responsibility for their own actions.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I think, I mean, even the way I described it, right, if a woman is violent, automatically there's that empathy gap, isn't it? There's automatically a sense that, okay, she must have some problems that require help, right? And often that is the case. You know, often they do have some sort of psychological disturbance, personality disorder. Whereas, yeah, if it happens on the male side, often the instinct is, well, you know, that's something innate. It's more about character. And there are elements of that sometimes. Let's not remove responsibility. But we don't then think, okay, well, how do we modify this behaviour? They may well have their own concerns or psychological problems that can be worked upon. That can actually be worked upon and help. That's not an instinct we have in the culture.
So when you were told you had to get re-educated if you wanted to get back into being a white ribbon ambassador, and you decided not to, you're very happy to be out of it, essentially. You're not happy with the work that's being done by White Ribbon?
The whole thing fell down. I mean, that whole idea of having male champions, etc., that sort of fell in a heap.
White Ribbon is continuing. They're still working in schools. That's what worries me, and I think that's what we have to do is, obviously this whole campaign we're running is about shaming boys in schools, and this is part of the story. So thank you, Tanvir, for joining us today. I'm very pleased you've been able to share your experience.
Thanks very much, Bettina. I think it's very important.
He's so amazing, isn't he? And it's interesting he brought up domestic violence and how women are so much a part of that. And there's been some interesting research into domestic violence in the home and the women's role in that, in the family. Tell us about that research.
Well, there's a particular research study which is a good 20 years old now, which is, and there's a reason for that. They'll never do it again because it produced a result they did want to know about. This is one of our leading research organisations, particularly in this area, the Institute of Criminology. I went out and asked young people whether they'd ever witnessed their fathers attacking their mothers or their mothers attacking their fathers, abusing their fathers. And the amazing thing is they ended up with almost the same percentage each way round. So just as, we've got the figures here somewhere, you'll see them in a minute, there were just as many, just as high a percentage of kids had seen their dads attacking their mothers as the other way round. It was within a percentage of each other. And that's really fascinating. What I loved about that particular journal article is the fact that if the author didn't even acknowledge that particular piece of data. He just talked about, whatever it was. It's nearly a quarter of the kids had seen their fathers attacking their mothers. And that's all he talked about. In the middle of it all was this stunning result showing it works both ways. And you think about that. You've got kids in every classroom who've living with a violent mother. I mean, they're just as likely to be living with a violent mother as a violent father.
Yes.
And we're saying, shut up about that. We don't want to know. We only want to know about your violent dad. And that is the most extraordinary thing.
This is the problem, the agenda that is being driven by just so many different areas, whether it be researchers or teachers. How do we beat this?
Well, look, and we've had now over 40 years of international research on this subject. There was an enormous study that looked at in America, which looked at 1,700 peer-reviewed projects and analysed all of that vast body of research. And they found that, what emerges very clearly is this picture of two-way violence. In most violent homes, it's not about an aggressive dad beating up the wife. It's just as likely that the wife will be aggressive to the man, and there is this constant picture of two-way violence. Now, here's a famous Canadian psychiatry professor explaining the results of that big study.
First one that I wanted to tell you about is that men are the victims of intimate partner violence at rates comparable to women.
So
that's just a tiny little summary. I mean, obviously this is part of a big lecture, but that's the pivotal point. It's two-way violence. Kids are witnessing two-way violence. They're not just growing up in homes where there is this patriarchal, authoritarian father, that everyone's afraid of. That's a very tiny, small part of the overall picture of violence when you look at the research. And yet, here we have, in our schools across the country, this ideology being taught based on a myth that it's all about men.
And of course, white women it's happening in schools across Australia now.
Absolutely, and they're receiving government funding. They're being invited into schools. The school teachers, think they're doing a great thing, inviting them all in. I mean, it really is a problem.
Denying children's real life experiences and
silencing. As we talked about earlier when we were talking to Christopher, silencing the boys who are being abused. They don't dare speak out about the fact that they might be being abused by another boy. They might be the male victims of sexual violence, whatever it is. And teaching, what's the other side of this that's really worrying, is teaching them that sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
Yeah, well, I think that they're more likely to be abused or murdered by their mothers.
That's right.
Rather than their fathers.
I mean, that's extraordinary. We never hear that, do we?
No.
But what is it? Yeah, I was talking about the girls. What does it teach girls? That they are never responsible. That even though they are out in the playground, they see girls bullying other girls. They see, sometimes physical aggression. They never have to have responsibility for that.
No, when you look at those Kempsey boys.
Yeah, we've got some examples here of the sort of white ribbon programs, and this is absolute classic of boys being made to speak out against violence against women.
I will stand up, speak out and act to prevent men's violence against women. I will stand up, speak out and act to prevent men's violence against women.
We've got hundreds of these poor boys having to make this statement. But look at this, here are the girls, which I think is fascinating.
I will stand up, speak out and act to prevent men's violence against women.
We will stand up, speak out and act to prevent men's violence against women.
So everybody is saying the same message.
It's the same mantra, isn't it? Brainwashing.
No different, no responsibility for girls.
No.
And I love this. We've got a headmaster here. Have a listen to him.
It's about young men standing up and speaking out, and it's about young women expecting respect.
Young women expecting respect.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have to earn respect.
No, exactly.
We don't have to take responsibility for our actions. We are eternal victims. It's all about passing the responsibility on to males.
And it's a two-way street. Respect is a two-way street.
But that's not what's being taught at all anymore.
It's so terrifying. And let's just hope it's happening in the homes. And it isn't, I know. But I hope that mothers of sons and the fathers of sons who realise how damaging this is. It's grooming a generation the wrong way. I just hope the parents are trying to counter this, those who are aware.
Well, I mean, but of course that's why we're here tonight, to expose what's going on in our schools. And I hope everyone's listening. Don't just sit there and tut-tut and think, this is all shocking. Think about how you can help us. Think about who you know, who's got kids in schools or kids who've left school, who would help us put together evidence about your school. We're particularly interested, I mean, some of the smaller, the rural areas, the small areas who have a local newspaper, that's where I figure we might get some real traction,
Yeah, grassroots.
If it's in Wagga and there's a high school there, and we go along to the Wagga local newspaper and say, look what's happening in your school. I mean, I was just so pleased to see the media starting to respond to this. And we need you guys out there to start thinking about coming towards us with some evidence. Yeah.
We have another guest who we're about to introduce. Phillip Bligh, who's an Indigenous leader from the New South Wales Central Coast. Now, he approached you, didn't he, Bettina, because he'd been asked to review a white ribbon training manual. And he was so shocked by what he read that he wanted to speak out. So, Phil, thank you for joining us and thank you for reaching out to Tina. What was it that really concerned you about that white ribbon program?
Yeah, thanks, Prue, and thank you, Bettina, for inviting me to take part in this discussion. look, I'm all for stopping violence against women, but I think we really need to have a balanced and honest conversation about this. I was commissioned in 2017 by White Ribbon Australia to review their training manual. It's actually a long title called Engaging Men to Prevent Gender-Based Violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Communities Training Manual. And, there were two things that sort of really jumped out at me straight away that really made my antenna twitch about the White Ribbon campaign. The first was the assumption that the violence was one way. Mm-hmm. They depicted men as being the sole perpetrators of violence and women being the victims. And I knew that wasn't true in our communities, that violence was two ways. Mm-hmm. In fact, I've been involved in a lot of discussions over the years as part of my work in the public service in Aboriginal communities, talking to lots of Aboriginal people about domestic violence. And they all agree that it's two ways. In fact, Aboriginal people prefer to call it family violence. Mm-hmm. And that's recognition of the fact that it's two-way violence. Yep. And I was really curious about White Ribbon's total ignorance of female violence in our communities. Why would they depict it that way?
Yeah. And as you say, I mean, you knew that from your own, growing up in an Indigenous community. You knew it from the consultations you'd done across the country. You've done that there is this issue of women being very violent. In fact, and we've got some statistics here that when we first talked, Phil and I, dug out the official statistics. Extraordinary figures that Aboriginal women are more than twice as violent as men in general. They're the second highest group in our community in terms of violence after Indigenous men. We never hear that, do we, Phil?
No, I think it's something that we really need to talk about. We need to have a mature and sensible conversation about it because it points to something that is much more serious in our communities. It's much more deeper than the White Ribbon narrative that, violence, it's only males that are violent.
And I know you're particularly worried about this, Phil, because you're very conscious of the vulnerability of young Indigenous men. You've got a very high suicide rate amongst Indigenous males, and these boys, so many boys are growing up with low self-worth anyway, let alone come along and be told they're part of the patriarchy and be told they're somehow privileged. And it must be just extraordinary thinking about the impact of that.
Yeah, well, I was actually sitting around the table with people from White Ribbon, upper echelons of the management, the CEO, in fact, and, I made the comment that it was a bit rich to suggest that I was an oppressor of white women, considering both my parents were taken away as children up in Queensland. But the problem runs really deep in our society. I think there's a lot of frustration, confusion. There's a lot of anger and resentment within the people in general within our community, and that needs to be understood in its proper context.
And as you say, I mean, this very complex situation of cultural, societal, psychological factors, and in particular in the Indigenous community, the drug and alcohol problems, the sort of thing we were talking earlier to Tanvir Ahmed, the psychiatrist, about that sort of complexity that certainly applies in your own community, doesn't it?
That's right. So this narrative sort of covers all that, and it draws our attention away from the real causes of those problems that exist in our community, and the problems in the Aboriginal community when it comes to substance abuse, drug and alcohol abuse, suicide rates are magnified. They're much higher than in mainstream.
That's right. Well, Phil, I know we haven't got much time with you tonight. People can go back and look at the video I made with you if they want to see more information about this. But thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
So, Phil, it's great that Phil has reached out to you and is talking about this, because it's so important that we understand that this is insidious. It's creeping into every part of society.
Yeah.
And that's what's so scary. And I know that you say that this misguided feminist theory is right through the school curricula, and clearly it is, that men are privileged, that we live in a patriarchal society where men control women.
And that is the essential narrative that's out there everywhere. And that's what many of the people who've come to me complaining about what's going on in these sorts of programs have been concerned about that particular aspect. And there was one teacher in particular who contacted me a few years ago, actually, and he was talking about, I suppose, the equivalent in a way of the South Australian program we were talking about earlier, and this is called, in Victoria, it's a Respectful Relationships program, which is a bit of a joke when you think about it. It's only one way respect,
yes,
of course.
Of course.
But it's this same idea. It's about shaming boys, it's about teaching that normal male behaviour is toxic and dangerous. All the examples are of aggressive males, nothing about female responsibility, and so on. Now, I want to show a little bit more about this particular program. Funnily enough, just last night, I received our first report. We've started this campaign through of getting people to come and report to us about what's going on in the schools, and I received an update on this particular Respectful Relationships program in Victoria, and he sent me the latest curriculum, and it's exactly the same themes, this feminist claptrap about patriarchal society, about sexist, misogynist behaviour from males, and presenting that as the cause of domestic violence. Now I think we've got images of this particular
this is the story of
respectful
how gender
relationships.
This is
the whole
to the
stuff
murder
that's
of one
being
Australian
taught.
woman almost every week.
Wow.
Even though both his parents work, on the weekends his mum does the housework while dad watches sport. When he cries about being bullied at school, his dad tells him to stop being such a girl and just punch him right back. In such a world, disrespect and hostility is excused, and violence against women is far more likely.
I mean, this is the basic thing. We've all seen it in those absolutely ghastly television ads that the government... this government has spent billions of dollars on that stuff. The boy slamming the door in the girl's face, and now they've got a whole new raft of ads like that. And that is, as I was saying, that at the heart of that is the idea of this privileged patriarchal male dominating women. And what was interesting about this particular teacher who contacted me from Victoria a few years ago is he'd had anything but a privileged upbringing. He'd grown up with a violent mother and had a really rough time. And we ended up, I'm going to show you now a little bit clip from the video we put together where he's reading out a talk he prepared for the other teachers about the fact he was no privileged male.
I am obviously white, I am male, and I grew up in a Christian middle-class household. I appear to be the poster boy for white male privilege. There are staff here who would willingly place me in this category. However, my life hasn't been a poster for privilege because of my colour, my gender, or social status. And I am not Robinson Crusoe. For everything I articulate as a personal experience, there is another privileged white male in this school with a similar experience. I was a victim of domestic violence as a child. In a time where hitting children with a strap or wooden spoon was considered acceptable, I was savagely beaten and kicked in my home where I should have felt safe, at times wondering if I would survive. If you are picturing my father as the predator, you have fallen for the selective statistics of the media. It was my mother. I never defended myself by striking back, even though I could easily have done so. Men don't hit women. I blamed myself, and so did my mother. I forgave her years ago, but where was my white male privilege then? When there was a dispute with males at school or with my older brother, they were settled with fists, even though I would have preferred to settle them with words and mediation. I didn't get that choice. When I appealed for help from teachers or my parents, I was simply told to hit him back. That didn't feel like privilege when I watched my sisters receive compassion and adult intervention. I ended up running away from home before I finished my schooling. The benches of Spencer Street Station became my bed in the middle of winter. Where was my privilege then? When a youth worker rescued me from those benches and tried to get me a job based on my skills, the employment gatekeepers would not let me apply for any office jobs, even though my touch typing speed was tested at double that required, and accuracy was well above the minimum. Men don't type. I was allowed to labour on a farm, or on a work site, or as a storeman in a factory. In a fast food chain, males were out back, cooking, getting their arms burned by spitting oil and treated like scum. Girls were front of house, nurtured into their roles. Where was my privilege then? Today, when I walk along the streets behind a woman, I feel the need to cross the road because I don't want her to feel unsafe. But in reality, statistics say I am more likely to be assaulted than she is. I have been assaulted, requiring hospitalisation. Where was my privilege then? When we genderise all our resources and discussion to point at the bad men in this world, we are simply speaking to our own ignorance. Bad men exist. Bad women exist. Most of us are good people.
Oh gosh, how powerful is that? You know, you can really see the resentment and anger inside that man, and you can understand why he feels that way. And this is what's so worrying me, the damage this is doing to our men and our boys. This is terrifying. He was so powerful, and I just feel so sad for him and for all the men and all the boys who are being told that they are wrong, that they are bad, they are dangerous, they are toxic.
Boys like him in households where they're being abused.
Exactly.
Who can't speak out.
And they can carry that for the rest of their lives. That man is damaged for the rest of his life.
Yeah. And very brave to speak out in the school in that setting. Okay, so I hope we've inspired people to not just, agree with us.
No, get active.
We have to get active. We have to start to try to change this. And that's what this campaign is all about.
Yeah. Go to the website.
Yeah, what we have to do is go to the website. All the information is there, which shows you how to make a report. Just write to us. Tell us a little bit about what you've seen, in the curriculum, or find other people for us who could do that.
Yes.
Send us a bit of evidence. We'll be in touch. We have a group of mothers ready to work with you, to put the information together, to help you decide if you have to be anonymous. I'm sure many people will feel they need to be so. Although I did mention maybe we can find some ex-students or ex-teachers,
yes.
People who are no longer teaching, who are in a position now to speak out about this. I mean, there must be people throughout the community who know what's going on in our schools, who can start to change all this. And I think we will get a really good response from the media if we can get the stories out there.
I agree, 100%. And I just think we need to create a movement. There are so many people who agree with this, who understand that this is such a wrong we're doing to a generation of our children and a generation of our adult men. And it's time for us all to stop being silent and to be active.
Absolutely. And if you can't think of anybody to help with coming forward with evidence of this in the schools, maybe on our website we've also got a flyer we've printed out, which is telling people about the campaign, which you could just go and print off and stick on a community notice board in your local cafe somewhere. Or if you're really brave, I was thinking you could go on a Saturday morning down to the sports field where there were lots of parents gathered watching their kids play sport and hand them out and tell them about mothers and sons.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And don't forget also that we really need funds to help us get this out. So if you can go to the website, you can also donate.
Go on our GoFundMe page. We had a very nice, generous donation from someone last night. We were thrilled about because we've got a very small team and a bit of extra income that allows us to pay people to do things occasionally rather than do it all ourselves. So that'd be really great if people are on board. So I hope we've really inspired people to get off their bottoms and get involved rather than, and write to politicians and write to departments of education people and tell them this is not good enough what's happening to our boys.
I think we need to all understand it's on us now. We cannot be silent. We have to stand up and be counted. So I hope you'll join us. I think Bettina is doing such an amazing, powerful job. And to all the women of Mothers of Sons, thank you for being proud and standing up for your sons. This is it for tonight, but you won't be not hearing from us again because this is too important an issue. We want to thank Ben Elkett at Damn Good Productions, who did a damn good job.
This wonderful place
who's helped us with this video.
Studio, and he's constantly helping put everything together and help with our videos, and he's a wonderful contributor. Not a mother, but a contributor to Mothers of Sons.
And to all the team who's working behind the scenes from Mothers and Sons and here at Damn Good for making this happen. And to all of you watching who plan to help us get boys shaming out of Australian schools, thanks for watching us. See you next time. And please speak loudly and often.